Hello everyone, today we talk about Franks, Longobards and the Papacy. Yeah, I know, we discussed this recently with those two videos on Highstolf King of the Longobards, but nevertheless, this is an omnicomprehensive consideration on the big policies or strategies, wherever you want to call them, that actually triggered the Frankish intervention in the Apennine Peninsula. The bond was created at that point with the, let's say, the reborn Western Empire and the Papacy. Yes, I know it's not properly the Western Roman Empire, but this is very debatable. Probably during the course of the video, we will repeat something that we expressed also elsewhere in other videos, especially on the migration era. Really asking what's really the concept of empire, because I accept fully, for instance, from a strictly legalistic point of view, the say Byzantine prerogatives of the Roman Empire and so on, but at the same time, what is often overlooked is that there is not just a legalism. The empire was born literally out of a religious and pagan, by the way, mindset, for which really the imperium as such, as this military faculty and capability, fundamentally is driven by actually just by the divine glory, and therefore, at that point in history, the West had remained devoid of a strong imperial power, cannot be denied. So also in here, this is a perspective that is brutally overlooked because of many reasons, chiefly the fact that this ideology was not fully formalized. At that point, also the ambiguity that existed naturally between the emerging let's say newborn Western Empire and also the papal prerogatives made it something that up to that point nobody had really thought, institutionally speaking. So also the legitimization of the empire came with certain limits, both for cultural and political reasons, but maybe we'll discuss this another time. Yet I think this is overlooked dramatically, even in sheer, aside from the ideological point of view, in sheer political and strategical aspects too that are very important to observe how eventually the events of Western Europe, not only say of the whole Europe and the Mediterranean, developed in the following centuries. And this is something we've stressed many times. I mean, the Frankish intervention into Italy against the Longobards to support the Pope was not, at the end of the 8th century, such a wasn't really something to give for granted. Actually, I made a video that is in the migration era playlist, if I'm not wrong, that actually dealt with similar problems concerning what the political situation in the 6th century, more or less in the same areas. The video is called The 6th Century Balance of Power, Goths versus Franks in Constantinople. In here, basically, we have something very similar. In that video, we were discussing fundamentally how the Goths that at the time didn't rule just over Italy, just Longobards did, for instance, at the end of the 8th century, but also on Spain, because the Ostrogoths had managed to extend this protectorate during the minor age of the Visigothic king, also on the Iberian Peninsula. And therefore, Franks, the Merovingian Franks at that time, and Constantinople created this axis, let's say, that was also very resemblant of the ancient equilibrium between kind of the Western and the Eastern Roman Empire. It was very different, but it was at the same time, in terms of sheer political color, something close to it, because the Ostrogoths, the Goths in general, at that point, were presenting themselves as a sort of not really anti-imperial identity, but they were stressing, politically speaking, that Germanism and Arianism that was embraced still by both the Gothic kingdoms and all those Germanic populations that still dwell in Central Europe at that time were under the pressure of the Merovingians. So basically, This was an axis that was counterbalancing two imperial ambitions, respectively, the one of the Merovingians in continental Europe and the one of the Byzantines in the Mediterranean. At the end of the 8th century, so now, the situation is very, very different for many reasons. Chiefly the contraction of generally speaking, of the European system as such after the great 6th century crisis that was triggered chiefly or seemingly in part, at least by the same Byzantine reconquest of the western provinces, chiefly of Italy. We don't know actually where the plague stemmed from, but you know that fundamentally during the Gothic War into Italy, the plague spreads. It causes massive problems locally, but it's part of this broader pandemics that explodes actually all over Eurasia. But we don't really know what the causes were. Also in here we discussed, whether it was a broadly structural reason, it was something, happening by chance, or whether the system was already in fact so weakened that now the plague had an easier time, say, to spread. This is not important now. The important is that at the end of the 8th century, there is a further spread instead, or a further growth, fundamentally, of the European system. You know that between the 8th century, now especially the second half of the 19th century and 10th century sometimes are considered as a new phase of contraction, chiefly of the second invasions and so on. But even if we look at the overall, at the general rebirth of the economy, of the demographics of Europe by the famous year 1000, actually this had started consistently already during the 10th century. So now the whole European system was kind of putting itself into motion very slowly indeed, especially in the 8th century, but it was bringing back those ambitions, imperialistic ambitions that had driven the major powers of Europe back in the day, a few centuries before, and that now had finally the necessary resources to carry such policy out once again. Also, in here, it wasn't given for granted. For this reason, I stress the progressivity of this event. It's kind of debatable to state that fundamentally the powers at the time, like the Franks, the Longobards, the Byzantines, were fundamentally aware of the kind of the progress that was going on. Of course, we know from their legislations, this is particularly evident in the additions to the Edict of Rotary in the Longobard Kingdom, that of course there was a new economical vitality that was spreading, and that made increased number of transactions of currency circulation. It's not like that, but at the same time, it's also difficult to see this in perspective. Nevertheless, you have fundamentally the revival, and this is probably one of the most important things in the West, at least, of the Frankish ambitions. Now, the Byzantines, we don't open the chapter on them, but fundamentally they were, they also had similar ambitions now that were revived. But at that time they were pretty busy in the East, and they had lost grip on the Western provinces. Parts of Italy were still under the Byzantine control, but it was effectively just a decentralized administration that was also by osmosis pretty similar in terms of politics and society to the local Italic world, including the Longobard one. So there is this great problem for which there is a condition of balance, much more than what had happened in the 6th century, for which the Franks and the Byzantines are kind of equal competitors at this time in the broader European scenario. Of course, both of the empires do not have the necessary power and strength to encompass the whole picture, let's say, to in fact rebuild what was the dream at the time, still rebuilding the Roman Empire. After all, this is stressed very much. Sometimes this is very important to stress, because sometimes we give for granted that the early medieval times broke out, the so-called Dark Ages, this terrible moment. And as if everybody woke up one day and said, okay, we are in the Middle Ages, we completely change perspectives, ideas, orientation, theories, ambitions, etc. This was completely false, especially by this time. So we are at the end of the 8th century, at the end of second half of the 8th century. The times of the Roman Empire back in the day weren't actually that far, especially also in the West, naturally, not just given the Byzantine East, where the empire had remained effectively standing. But in the West especially, it was still this idea that the empire did exist, and whatever it had been, it was something important, was to be reconstituted. We also stressed very much in these videos on the migration era how probably the same Germans had accepted the concept of Romanity of the empire by certain measure. This was chiefly the case of the Franks. It was partly something that also the Visigoths, before being wiped out by the Arabs, had embraced. Even in the Anglo-Saxon Heptarchies, you find some kind of inspiration to these imperial models. You find even terms like not just imperator but even basileus, which is frankly very, very interesting. There were other Germans who didn't give a damn. One were the ones dwelling still into pagan Germany, like Saxony, which was by the way, the only German land that had at this point had not been practically incorporated in one way or another into the orbit, at least, of the Frankish domination. But there were peoples like also the Longobards that, albeit fully Catholic at this time, and also, in fact, having built something very civilly advanced, partly through the evident Romanization, most intense Romanization of the land where they had been developed in, that is Italy itself. They were inspiring themselves. They were sticking, however, very faithfully to political and institutional Germanic models. So were not absolutely contaminated by any form of Romanity, even when Aistulf at this point seizes the Exarchate finally, so putting an end formally to the Byzantine domination in this vast area of northern central Italy. He doesn't acquire sort of an imperial, he never felt to act on behalf of the empire, but simply felt himself that, just like King of the Longobards, was protecting the Romans, that were, by the way, the Romans just dwelling into the Italian peninsula. Actually, on the video on Aistulf, we observed also how there are rumors about especially in this very difficult situation when the Franks, for the first time, invaded the peninsula, so defeating also the Longobard army and so on, but eventually coming back, so not seizing it. The same Aistulf might have tried to revive some sort of relation with the Byzantines in terms of maybe of the Fedus, of the ancient Fedus. After all, the Longobards before entering into Italy, or maybe still when entering into Italy, because we're not really sure, were in fact Roman Federati at that point, not much, mostly by name. It was just at that point, it wasn't like, it had been for the Franks or the Goths that were really, integrated into an empire that functioned and used them as such. At that point, the Fedus was signed just as a sort of friendship of an alliance of this Longobard entity that dwelt along fundamentally between the upper and the middle Danube, to control them. But this is the point. The Longobards had never fully accepted, had actually never even minimally, this is the point, accepted any form of Romanization in their political, institutional, and juridical models. They had been definitely massively influenced by the Romanic practice, let's say, that obviously had favored also the construction of their own kingdom into the Italian peninsula with the local personnel, with the evidently with the projection in a world was very, very different from the one that had emerged from back in the 6th century. But they stayed faithful to their origin. And this was very much praised, because even the Franks, that in this sense were building, especially in their through their dynasties, this great of kind of proto crypto, whatever you want to call it, imperial grandeur, that was definitely inspired to the Roman one, and in a certain sense also perceived as to be carried out on behalf of the same empire, because back in the day the Merovingians had received, in fact, the vicary of the Gauls, so ruling on those lands on behalf of the empire. The Franks also, even the Franks had their own Germanism in their veins. They were actually much more still much more German in everyday life, we can say. I know it doesn't sound much, but they had remained much more Germanic in many ways, in politics, society, in juridical practice than the Longobards, and now were years of light ahead in terms of civil, juridical praxis and administration and so on, which is also very, very much overlooked. Just remember that everybody who tells you that the Longobards at this time were kind of some bloodthirsty barbarian monsters who had dropped the peninsula into the darkness and so on is just plainly an ignorant, and there is nothing bad in being an ignorant as long as you don't start talking about things you don't know. So read the existing bibliography on the Longobards, and then comes here certain things. It's not a surprise that the Carolingians, when conquering Italy, not just maintained the Longobard kingdom standing, in the sense that Charlemagne himself took in the Longobard crown. They didn't dismantle it. They kept on their administration because it was highly functional, and it was even drawn in together with, naturally, with some other Romano-Italic administrative models coming from the Papal and Byzantine areas. They remodeled, or at least they tried, because eventually they didn't have much of a success, their own administration, their own imperial organization, even on this kind of more Stata-like Mediterranean models, which failed because, in fact, Frankish society was still something extremely different, relatively backwards, definitely. There is one thing that the Franks know how to do better than anyone else at this time. That is war. And that's what all the Franks are all about, literally. The only great thing the Carolingians are able to accomplish that is this great ecclesiastical and cultural reform that survives effectively their own empire. But aside from the vassalic beneficiary clienteles that are definitely useful and had been bringing, in fact, the same Frankish military power to be revived, they fundamentally didn't leave anything that was politically or administratively solid. It's something that definitely, that from an institutional profile, post-Carolingian Europe sees the survival of the concept of the empire, of the relative kingdoms, sub-kingdoms that were part of the empire, and the idea of public prerogative, which it was something pre-existing definitely in the empire, but it's still meaningful because it proves that this kind of proto-feudalism that was developing in this time had its own gluing factor, aside from the privatization that laid deeply at its own roots, and that was, in fact, the same reason for which the same empire had crumbled at the end of the day, because the Franks didn't have any real concrete idea of what public authority should be. I mean, it was extremely weak, and they basically made it survive just because it overlapped at that point with certain private prerogatives. It's a bit like what the Merovingian and Carolingian empires were in a nutshell. The idea that what belonged previously to the people of the Franks, so all the freemen and so on, now it was de facto, even if maybe not formally, but de facto it was a private possession of the ruling dynasty, and this is how it was seen like. It was really like a prey of war, and this tells you how deeply German in nature this conception really was. When the Merovingians, when Clovis seizes these wide areas of Gaul and wipes out literally all the rest of the Frankish nobility that could compete with him. He basically sees the whole thing as a sort of a private possession, and the empire, in fact, followed this. Or the kingdom, wherever you want to call it, actually. Followed the events of the dynasty. I mean, even when the Merovingian kingdom gets disgregated, it physically becomes inconsistent, doesn't exist anymore. It's just like four split kingdoms. Still, however, the Merovingian bloodline was maintained as the only legitimizing element in this way, and even the Carolingians will be relatively obsequious and respectful towards it until almost the very end, when in fact the popes intervene and grant to the Carolingians the same royal dignity over the Frankish people, and incidentally this also eventually this greater imperialistic imperial authority that was innate also here in the Frankish mindset. This is why sometimes I waver when I have to tell what was really the Frankish kingdom, both in Merovingian and in Carolingian times. In Carolingian times it's more evident, but even before, was it a kingdom or was it de facto an empire? Because de facto it was born at least as an empire, where there was the Frankish kingdom at the center, and then around all these subjugated peoples that were fundamentally related to the Franks by this relation of submission. So the Longobards had escaped this. I mean, the Franks and the Longobards had been at war initially in the 6th century, when in fact, as we were saying in that other video, the Franks and the Byzantines launched this joint offensives in the Po Valley to get rid of the Longobards from Italy, and at that point, who knows what? Because, by the way, at the end of the Gothic War, before the Longobards kicked in, even the Franks and the Alemanni had jointly invaded and raided Italy up to the south, actually, before being defeated by Narses at that point. So that's really the big narrative, and this is fundamentally, as long as the Franks had some power on their own, their main axis of expansion, their main direction of expansion was definitely meant to be the Mediterranean. This is often overlooked, especially if you follow certain historiographical perspectives that want to stress the continentality, were not the Nordic identity of the Carolingian Empire. But this is, in my opinion, a gross political and strategical misconception. The Franks naturally, and we have discussed this now extensively in the just a few days ago, actually. If you go into the Frankish history or Carolingian Europe playlist, you notice that a few days ago, we were discussing essentially the relation of the Frankish authority with the peoples at its borders, why they expanded, especially during Carolingian times, towards certain directions, and so on. And if you observe it, you see that even expansions like towards towards Saxony, towards also the Danubian line, give this solidly continental dimension to the Carolingian Empire. I mean, nobody can deny that the Carolingian Empire was fundamentally a continental European power. It wasn't really a Mediterranean power. But here also it makes a difference to really understand what was the political goal, because what were the Longobards, for instance? Longobards were into Italy, but they weren't much of a Mediterranean power proper. Before conquering Rome, they were actually rising to be a pretty consistent power, but they still didn't have, at least they still couldn't develop the potential that the urbanization and the coastal position of the Italian lands would fundamentally allow the same peninsula a few years afterwards with the maritime republics and so on. But the point here is the Mediterranean dimension perceived as in fact, an imperial dimension, and in its relation with Rome. Sometimes the invasion of the Longobard kingdom at the hands of the Franks is just treated as, it was that they just occupied this land, who was more or less like the others. No, it was definitely not like the others, and it was definitely the most important and most influential conquest that the Franks ever achieved. And as we were saying at the beginning of the video, was not is not to be given for granted up to the very last, actually, because even the events that brought to the final Carolingian conquest, that the Pippin the Short had invaded Italy twice before, but had kind of left it initially as still as a peer in the first time, then secondly as a sort of client state. But it's only with Charlemagne that the kingdom is the Italic kingdom is fundamentally incorporated into the Carolingian one and maintains its institutional prerogative. Is also the one to which the imperial dignity will be attached. All the Holy Roman emperors had mandatorily eventually to become kings of Italy, because in order to be crowned emperors, because otherwise they could have not been crowned by the popes, given that Rome was still kind of basically incorporated administratively, at least from the imperial perspective, into the Italic kingdom. From the Frankish perspective at that point. So whoever seized Italy had also this extremely heavy burden of protecting the papacy. By protecting, read things like trying, arguing with it all the time on who actually had the real power on the empire, and that's also what brought to the struggle of investitures. And these are all things that are really born legitimately from a historical point of view into with the same Carolingian conquest, and that have roots in these previous decades that eventually brought to the thing to happen, but otherwise it might have not succeeded. Even in the case of Charlemagne, indeed, let's not assume that if Charlemagne had died, but famously enough, even if his brother had not died, or had not been arrested and so on, and history could have gone towards a completely different direction. And in order to understand this process, you have to understand what the various perspectives fundamentally were. So, from a strictly Frankish perspective, the Carolingians were transforming the Frankish society into something completely into something at least very different to whatever had existed before. It's different to trace a sharp sort of watershed. Fundamentally, the more I read about the Carolingians, the more I think that fundamentally they didn't invent really anything new, but they definitely were extremely important in accelerating certain processes that, although proper of Frankish society, had not brought to the extremes, just like in fact instead they happened during the Carolingian times. The most important factor in this were fundamentally the vassalic clienteles. Let's be honest about this. This is what the Frankish Empire was about. The Frankish Empire was a huge, omnicomprehensive vassalic clientele. As much as the empire was considered as a private dominion and a private possession of the king, in spite of the coexistence of still this, political and institutional Germanic model where the freemen theoretically owned all the power and so on. In France, especially in France, let's say in this area that is today's more northeastern France and parts of Benelux and part of northwestern Germany, was things had gone very much otherwise, and especially in the westernmost part, actually, mostly in Austria, most of all, so really in today's northeastern France. We have explained countless times on Schwerpunkt why this was the case, why that local society was so functional to the development of vassalic clienteles. So I send you to those videos I made on things like if you look in the Frankish history playlist, It's plenty of videos that explain actually the nature of the Frankish clienteles. There is in part, probably the most important one, that is the famous Frankish commendatio. That this video is particularly meaningful in my opinion. The Frankish commendatio at the origins of the vassalic beneficiary system. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. But basically, every single video that I made on the Franks, in a way or in another, either by anticipating or posticipating the topic I was discussing, deals with that, because literally all Frankish history is all about this, and it's all about these clienteles. Call them as you like, vassalic beneficiary, call them as this ancient Romano-Germanic clienteles, whatever you want it, but just have pretty clear in mind that Frankish society was at this point, especially in the westernmost areas, now a completely kind of proto-feudal society, where the peasantry had grown fundamentally disarmed, subservient, depending on these greater clienteles that now were made up by an elite that was more than the traditional Romano-Germanic elite. It was developing in something much more consistent, into a professional elite, in the sense it was a political and military elite, where mounted combat was becoming increasingly widespread. The elitary nature of the equipment, also of the training, of the lifestyle of these Frankish lords was increasing, and this was due essentially because of a balance that existed into the distribution of property, of resources. It was typical of Gaul, because Gaul was the country in Europe that, in Western Europe, that had maintained more markedly the intact the senatorial estates that were fundamentally seized by these Gallo-Roman and Frankish aristocracies and maintained during this early medieval first centuries of the Middle Ages, and that knew no equals in the rest of Europe. There was something relatively similar in Spain with the Visigoths, but it had not given rise in there. It would be more interesting to study. I don't know excessively much about the Visigothic case, but even in there, the result had been actually a kind of a weak monarchy, however, where basically every Visigothic nobleman was kind of a lord on his own, where also the church had an enormous power, much more actually than in Gaul, where it was very powerful, possibly even more in terms of sheer resources, but it was better framed into the monarchical system. And this is the real point: is that the Franks, in spite of all, because of this extreme emphasis that had been put on the monarchical prerogatives since the Merovingian times, had made survive the idea that this clientele still belonged to a chief, not to, like it was in Spain, to this council of of noblemen that basically dictated what the kings had to do. Also through the episcopal councils of Toledo, famously enough. There's a video made on that is quite eloquent on this. In Francia, because this was its real name, this kind of more strictly political and military organization and coordination of society was more marked and evident. Also in here we have to stress, as we were saying before, that by the end of the 7th century, the Frankish kingdom as such it's very difficultly identifiable, because now it had split into 4 chunks. The great power that the Franks had under Clovis, is this enormous united Francia, was even starting a sort of administrative system inspired eminently to the local Roman traditions, had faded completely away. I mean, legitimately, by the end of the 7th century, the Longobards were literally by themselves more powerful than the Franks. Were actually the most powerful entity existing in Western Europe at the time, for giving you the dimension of how much the Frankish power had fragmented. The Carolingians saved this. Even though having to deal now with a world that was in fact so much fragmented, that was fundamentally based on this concept of privatization that from the dynasty had fundamentally emanated into the rest of society, and the local aristocrats believed to be fundamentally all kind of lords on their own. And this is the major ingredient in the final recipe that kind of doomed the Carolingian Empire to crumble in such a short time. Because when the system, how did the Carolingians made it? Where basically they engaged, they committed all this aristocracy to join their political cause by expanding either on other Franks or surrounding enemies. Now, what the empire is created, it has overstretched. There is nothing more to conquer, to maintain profitably, and therefore these Franks turn fighting against each other. Chief example, the same Carolingians. Just to say how this idea of private advantage, this individual competition, and this lack of a solid central authority eventually was so rooted actually in the Carolingian Empire to bring eventually to its ultimate collapse. And there wasn't much to collapse in this sense, because from our perspective it looks like a collapse, as if it was kind of another Roman Empire, but it wasn't like that, because there hadn't been up to that point fundamentally a true public, nothing like a state and a real administration. It was simply the same private aristocrats that personally dealt with the lands that had been entrusted to them, and the whole system was based on this. And even the disgregation of Carolingian Empire, it didn't bring to the disgregation of a state. It brought to simply to the fluidification of this system that had no more political needs to remain cohesive, aside from this skeleton, fundamentally, this frame that was represented by the empire in its imperial dignity, and at a territorial level especially, the various kingdoms in which the empire was split, that maintained this kind of a legitimizing authority. It was meant as public. It was even taken seriously as such, but only as an opportunity to aggrandize the private powers and the various lords, and that's how seigneurial Europe was born, and how at the end of the day also feudal Europe is born. But at this time, by the end of the 8th century, the Franks are overexpanding. At this point, I mean, they're not overexpanding. They're brutally accelerating these expansions once again, thanks to the Carolingians. Let's tell it better. It's not really the Franks. The Franks are even now something very difficult to define fundamentally, because aside from a territorial and strictly juridical point of view, who is a Frank? Here the ethnical differences from a strictly genetical point of view do not exist anymore. These peoples are all mixed. Of course, in Eastern Francia, there is a more prevalent Germanic character. In the West, we're talking about Romance populations, but also in here the discriminant is linguistical, ethno-linguistical. It's not even clear. The Carolingian Empire doesn't have, for instance, a sort of real border on its own. This is pretty evident even when the Carolingian Empire kind of crumbled. There is this great area in the middle between the eastern and western Francia that is called Lotharingia, that eventually doesn't survive as a kingdom on its own. That remains, even for the rest of the Middle Ages, a sort of middle ground from which it's complicated to tell who's who. We're talking about where's the limit between Central Europe, between the German-speaking and the Romance-speaking areas. I mean, it's very difficult to actually find. Yeah, of course, there is a strict. You can find kind of a border in this sense, but it's still keeping in mind that this also came out of several years of national policies that these divisions existed before, but there were so many different political allegiances that made it switch from side to side. Just thinking about as a state like Bourgogne, that was born French and now also expanded into the Holy Roman Empire to encompass Flanders. So in here you have a world that has already lost, especially in terms of political participation, the ancient origins of the freemanship. I don't know, freedom. I don't know, of Germanic origin, and is increasingly subdued by these elites that are expanding within this same world. So literally fighting against other local, can say Frankish powers, but at least also Frankish ones actually, because the Carolingians rose fighting against the other major domes that were into Francia proper, but also the expansion at that point came into other lands like that were theoretically different from an ethnical point of view. Ethnical at this time means chiefly juridical, because that's really the real ethnical discriminant at this point. What kind of law you were following. It was originally a tribal law, but now was being used actually mostly for convenience and so on. And they expand, in fact, into this area. The Carolingians reassert the Frankish royal authority on all these various peoples that the Merovingians had conquered back in the day and that had autonomized themselves during the centuries. Talking about all the kind of regions that kind of do not even exist properly anymore, at least even as a proper autonomous political entity. The Alemanni, the Aquitanians, other populations that weren't even hadn't been really subdued by the Franks up to that point. Thinking about the Frisians, there's always this mark of Bretagne is always it's never actually annexed by the Carolingians, but there are expansions towards several directions. And this was carried out fueling constantly through war and feeding constantly through war the Frankish vassalic clienteles. We have said it many times. The whole thing consisted into this. It was a kind of a poor world where monetary circulation was pretty low. Everything, the wealth was based fundamentally on the land. So what did the Carolingians do? They start saying, okay, if you fight for me in my retinue, as a follower, as an armed warrior, I give you some land, and I give you this land that is theoretically is mine, because I'm the king of the Franks. So I own this land. It's mine. It's theoretically public. Think it as you like, but de facto it's mine. I'll give it to you, and what you have to do is to consider it as a prepaid service, fundamentally. So you settle on that land, and you draw from it all the resources that are necessary, all the wealth that is necessary for you to equip yourself as a mounted knight, fundamentally, with all its armor, its panoply, and that has to follow me with all the supplies drawn from that land and so on during my military expeditions that at this time in the Frankish world happened literally every single year, if not more. This is extremely meaningful that in the Frankish annals of these years, the only sometimes worth the only new worth of mentioning was that there had not been a military expedition. It was a kind of exceptional stuff, because literally the Franks went on for 1 century, let's be honest, 1 century, making war every single year. And if this didn't happen like once or twice, this was a kind of a big event, because that was what the Franks were all about. And if you wonder how the Carolingian military machine was so efficient, well, it was simply because of this, because the organ is developed by its own use. So This was a machine that had naturally been forged initially through these clashes among the various Frankish aristocrats for rising to the top, and acquiring this protection over the ruling dynasty of the Merovingians that now were used, in fact, just like puppets, fundamentally, as to confer, to legitimize the power of the majordomes of Francia. And then eventually, when the power is consolidated, will also the Carolingians acquire in the meanwhile, so that their true kingship by papal permission. This military action is directed towards the external, towards other peoples, etc. This process happens through also other dynamics that, however, still have as at the core, at the end of the day, the idea that there is a vassalic clientele that is prepaid for his military service through the land, and that joins the king at every single year in his military expeditions. And this was perceived, in fact, as a private bond. It is true that the land was royal and therefore theoretically public, but de facto the whole Frankish monarchy worked as a big private clientele. And as long as there was to conquer, as long as there was someone that opposed the Carolingians internally, or threatened the Frankish borders externally, there was always a good reason to go to war. Also, the development of cavalry, of heavy cavalry, dismounted professional elite, stems essentially from this reason, that local freemen not only had impoverished, weren't good for much, militarily speaking, but in fact they couldn't shift so quickly from one corner to the other of the empire, and you needed this mounted ready, combat ready mounted military elite that at least had to follow. Then of course it was always coupled with other contingents raised locally or even from some of the most far areas of the kingdom, but that was not much important. The important was really the core of the elite, the mounted elite that could serve the emperor and go around and fighting effectively. Naturally, at this time, also emphasizing the importance of heavy cavalry is kind of maybe too much, because these are just the beginnings. The Carolingian cavalrymen weren't like, the Norman cavalry of the 11th century, given that in that sense it wasn't properly a Norman cavalry, but it was actually a Frankish cavalry, now just made up by people who had been in origin of Danish descent, but it was stemming from Frankish models that had been evolving, not just militarily but also politically and institutionally for centuries at that point. But nevertheless, it starts from here. It's chiefly Charles Martel, even if it's kind of difficult to identify one precise moment when this starts. But it's chiefly Charles Martel that revives these clienteles, kind of gives them a more developed, a more consistent organization. Let's say, it starts this idea of remunerating the retinue, the military retinue of the king through this lens. This was at the on the short run kind of an easy way to control the kingdom, because there was always someone who was kind of eager to fight for you and to receive these benefits. Then the problem is, as we were saying before, when the empire overstretched, and at that point there wasn't much more to feed these aristocracies with, and therefore the whole system kind of crumbled, because this aristocracy was equally hungry, politically, economically, and it started kind of eating each other, and causing the ultimate collapse of the same cohesion of the Frankish system, that in fact now is completely kind of surpassed from its tribal base. This is kind of evident. At the end of the Carolingian Empire, there is nothing more like the ancient Frankish freeman ideal, even as Frankish proper. And in fact, what had happened during the Carolingian times is that the Vassalic clienteles had been developed additionally to the Frankish People's Army that theoretically was still there. It was, called in those conditions needs of war from the ancient royal ban that was at the base of every kind of Germanic levy of the time. It existed literally everywhere. It existed in Longobard Kingdom, it existed in Saxony, it existed in England. I mean, it was kind of the standard, and it was it remained alive, pretty well alive, actually, up to the full feudalization of Europe, where theoretically was still there, but it became kind of a chimera at one point, because the freemen at a certain point during the full Middle Ages, the late Middle Ages, decline definitely, and they're not much. They're not good for much. Especially when the mounted elite was at unchallenged on the battlefields. Then of course, towards the late Middle Ages, there is but at that point we can't talk in terms of warfare. A real what had characterized the Middle Ages anymore. It was mostly, from a tactical point of view, Renaissance warfare, where, huge blocks of thousands of pikemen supported by arquebusiers and so on started creating serious problems to cavalry. But that's another story, and it's still not mostly based on volunteers and professionals than just the peasants that still now remained where they were, in a world that had been crystallized and where the elites were now completely ruling over the situation. Here it was relatively very different, because still the freemanship, let's say, in the Frankish world was still alive, but it was definitely in decline at the beginning of the Twilight, fundamentally. So this, the Franks at this time kind of expand, so recreate this massive power that even goes beyond the Merovingian dominions. It conquers, in fact, Italy, Saxony. It crushes the Avars. It creates the Spanish mark. It creates a wide world into which that is definitely an evolution of what had existed before. This happened, in fact, as we have seen, largely through the clienteles, and it was something that, in fact, back in the 6th century could have not been achieved unless more favorable conditions had not brought to the plague, to this systemic contraction of the antique world that eventually in the process transforms into the early medieval one. And the Franks at this point are naturally there are other major structural reasons, such as the fact that France is an extremely wealthy place in terms of agricultural resources. So that was really the core base of, that's how you make the army moving. That's the impressive way the Franks managed to shift sometimes armies of literally tens of thousands at the time. We're talking about the 9th century, the 8th, 9th century, across Europe for thousands of kilometers. I mean, there you need a logistical system that really has, that first of all is amazing, only for the fact that it makes actually this army move. Secondly, it requires an enormous quantity of resources. And in my last video on the on the Franks, the one that this one, causes of late post Carolingian vulnerability to the second invasions, I was arguing, in fact, that on the long run also this economical requests, let's say, to the local population contributed to the further stratification of Frankish society, and therefore, in fact, post-Carolingian society is definitely a very different, I would say even a radically different, by certain standards, society from the one that existed before the Franks, because of this intensity, this constant orientation of the same Frankish society towards war. With all the impoverishment of the middle classes, now had to work increasingly for the land, for this elite, and not really going to war, but making them going to war for them. and in the process also losing part of their freedom, because now they weren't even so used to bear arms and so on. They didn't have even the opportunity, and naturally other reasons, because this wasn't, Frankish time, the Carolingian times. Sometimes you talk about Carolingian Renaissance, but it's not really. Even from a sheer economical point of view, there is not much of a renaissance or an improvement. There is a great market now that is formed, that is controlled by a unique political authority, that definitely starts shifting great masses of wealth, of resources, that trigger also the reprisal of the revival of trade, of long-range, minimum long-range trade, and especially in the North Sea. There's all the parentheses by certain standards is valid for what happens in the north, but it's not really there is not really a quantitative progress in this sense. It's mostly a market that gets transformed for the needs of these aristocracies that now have more in their hands, but really there is no great improvement of the living conditions of the average Carolingian subject. On the contrary, there is an impoverishment. This is particularly interesting because we see that from a political institutional point of view, there is an improvement even beyond in post-Carolingian times, but seemingly the freemen get always worse. So reflect how civilization can improve even with the with the sufferance and the decline of living conditions by certain standards. But even here the concept of improvement is quite relative, because it's still a relatively static system in terms of sheer energies and forces engaged, if not something that is de facto even contracting by certain standards again, especially during the times of second invasions, but more or less remaining the same and making it to more macroscopically developed in the following centuries by, I would say, by the sheer potential that Europe had after the contraction of late antiquity and the very first centuries of the Middle Ages. So what the Franks do at this time is definitely doesn't pass unnoticed to the rest of the world. I mean, to the rest of the world maybe is a big thing, but the rest of their world, that was fundamentally Europe, the Mediterranean, but also the near Middle East, because actually, the Carolingians and the caliphs of Baghdad also had very some diplomatic relations, also because now the main problem for the Franks became the Byzantines, and guess who was enemy of the Byzantines? The caliphs of Baghdad. So the Franks had these relations with them, because actually also who was in Spain and threatening Frankish Aquitaine from there was not really the same guy who ruled in Baghdad, where also the Islamic world was pretty much fragmented. So as always, nobody really cares about religion when it comes to politics, or either it's just an excuse or anything. But obviously this mostly impresses and triggers reactions into those powers that were surrounding geographically the Frankish, that were contiguous geographically to the Frankish Empire. This is particularly evident in the West, in fact, and in the case of the Roman pontiffs. So this is kind of self-evident. The Pope, but behind the Pope read the Roman aristocracies of Rome that remained, in fact, at that time definitely the most important city in the West still, and had at least for what concerns the Latin Germanic world, this evident situation of in Italy, where there was a decadence of the Byzantine power in the peninsula. This is kind of obvious. The popes are put under pressure by the Longobards that do not really have anything against the papacy in itself, that they have sometimes against single popes, and they generally speaking want to seize Rome as a political pawn, fundamentally to control just as much the Franks will practically do, or try to do better. So traditionally, the Pope, that was still formally part of the Byzantine Duchy of Rome and etc., but now de facto had been ruling by itself locally for several time, more than 1 century at this point, had traditionally relied on the Byzantines, on the Byzantine defense for dealing with the Longobard problem. Also, this is kind of an approximation because the popes, as we were saying now, had to deal with the Longobard threat and also in general with their own problems. Sometimes even aligning themselves with the Longobards against the Byzantines, where they became too demanding, kind of on their own. This is kind of interesting that the popes and the Byzantines never liked much each other. They had many struggles at this time, especially the Byzantines were pretty much even religiously weird. Just think about the iconoclasm and all that from a strictly Western perspective was considered at least very bizarre, and rightfully, because the Byzantines at that time were doing doctrinally speaking very, very debatable things for the sake of internal. In the case of iconoclasm, we don't even fully know why, even though there was always some kind of internal logic to the empire, and especially Constantinopolitan society, but definitely in the West they were saying, what the hell are you doing? And the popes at this time, say generally until the 11th century, the Gregorian reforms, the popes are very, very much orthodox. They always stand of kind. Interestingly enough, also the Longobards are. I mean, the Longobards never actually, even when they were Arian at the beginning, never actually carried out persecutions, or they often sided with the Papacy against Constantinople. They were supported generally, and therefore here you see a sort of Italic environment that had been kind of enucleating itself on its own, and considering itself as sort of a unique system. Here geographical things matter, because it is true that certain areas, especially of southern Italy, in the coastal cities, remains kind of more tied to the Byzantine East than to the Latin Germanic West. But generally speaking, especially in the Apennine hinterland, where the populations were largely rural and Longobard, because the Longobards had incidentally expanded mostly in the hinterland. They had left kind of the coasts to the Byzantines because they weren't much of a maritime power at all. Were perceiving themselves now as kind of something on its own, and even in the Byzantine territories, this awareness had brought to a general autonomistic attitude from the same Constantinople, which is pretty much evident, for instance, in the Exarchate of Ravenna, that even though is in constant dialogue with the Byzantines on what to do, with Constantinople on what to do or what not to do, is de facto sort of independent principality in that tries to do whatever they want, tries to do whatever he wants into the same Italy. But there is this tendency that is mostly driven by the Papacy at saying, let's try to make a sort of a Romano-Italic thing on its own back again. Let's get rid, not really that the popes wanted to get rid of the Byzantines. The Pope really looked actually more favorably tendentially at at least they kept watching continuously to Constantinople up to fundamentally the 12th century. I mean, you can argue that Rome is still a kind of a Byzantine oriented center, a Mediterranean oriented center, more than it is a continental one, continentally, up to the 12th century. But at the same time, there is this idea that the Pope now wants to gain, sees the collapse of Byzantine authority in Italy, also because of the advance of the Longobards, as an opportunity to take over the situation, to create a sort of independent power that can expand even territorially speaking. So, given the strained relations that existed at this point between the Longobards and the Papacy, because the Longobards, we'll see now, had fundamentally expanded, that they had come to conquest almost all the Wall Peninsula, territorially speaking, and just Rome stood in the way, especially after the fall of Ravenna. So the popes look at the Franks like saying, oh, look at those guys, they're kind of strong, right? Let's make them come here and get us rid of the Longobard problem. Because the popes were clever enough to understand that Italy, for instance, is not a very good battleground for anyone. So as it would happen fundamentally for all the medieval centuries and even beyond, the papacy remains this kind of a peripheral center between the continental and Mediterranean Europe that is very difficult to seize for both empires. And this is pretty evident in history of the Middle Ages. You have very schematically, from one side, continental Europe that is ruled by the Holy Roman Emperors, Mediterranean, or part of it that is ruled by the Byzantines, and guess where Rome is? It's right in the middle, and that's really a condition of force, because not just Rome, but also other entities, chiefly in central and southern Italy, but also in northern Italy, actually. Try always to play this card. We want to be autonomous. We want to mind our own business. What do? Is that every time one of the two sides become too powerful, I call the other, and they fight each other, and we support, and in the meanwhile we get our autonomy. This is what the popes, that are extremely clever, like the papacy has always been, especially in this time, kind of very, very clever, politically speaking, in the Middle Ages, decide to call the Franks, because they know that in spite of their enormous power, they will kind of never get fully in control of the situation on the Italian soil, fundamentally. Even though the main problem now is really the Longobard threat. I mean, probably the popes were not so happy, not even on the Franks entering into the affairs of the peninsula. But the Longobard threat now was massive. The Longobards had, seizing Ravenna, had basically taken down the major obstacle that separated the Po Valley in Tuscany from that were the core of the Longobard kingdom to the southern duchies, that they also had been able to subdue constantly without particular problems. Now, so the kingdom stretched from the Alps to almost to the Strait of Messina, just like the tip and the heel of the boot were kind of Byzantine in nature, but the hinterland was practically almost all Longobard, and so it was now just a matter of time before the Longobard army, that wasn't such a weak thing as it's often thought, because simply they got defeated by the Franks. Just remember, it was the Franks that were kind of stronger than the average, not that Longobards that were weaker than the average. They were now to take Rome, and the Longobards try actively even to besiege Rome. They don't make it, because Rome is a freaking huge city. For the logistical and technological means of the time, it's very difficult to take. But at that point, it wasn't even a problem of military solution. It was really electing the Pope who would support either at that point the pro-Longobard or the pro-Frankish faction. So it happened also in here. What would have happened if a pro-Longobard Pope had managed to take control of the city? Because that happened. We know that there were clashes in Rome between the partisans of the Longobards and one of the Franks. They were clashing against each other. And naturally, the Roman aristocracy was divided, because they all had different interests and were competing against each other. So even the different choice of a pope could have changed radically the course of European history at that point, because the Franks might have not been called to intervene. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. The Longobards, from their side, didn't quite have any. We don't really know what the grand strategy of the Longobard was once they would have conquered Italy. This is also very interesting to think, because objectively they weren't such a small power at this point anymore. They were similar to the Ostrogoths, and the however the relations of powers were a bit different now, because the Franks were kind of already more powerful than what the Merovingians had been in the 6th century. The Longobards had almost all of Italy, but not certain other lands. They didn't have so much influence on the Mediterranean, that now was also kind of dominated by the Arabs, by the Muslims, and they didn't control these Danubian areas like Pannonia and Dalmatia. Dalmatia is Balkanic area of the Adriatic Sea. So many people say, first of all, it was normal for the Longobards to have as a first aim the conquest, the political unification of the, geographically speaking, of the Italian peninsula. That's kind of normal. You have this big. Let's talk a little bit, because this is a matter of perspectives. I don't know whether to start. Okay, let's get it later, because we'll present both the Frankish and Longobard strategical perspectives. They're kind of interesting in this picture. So, sticking to the papacy for now, the popes, as it's known, they first call Charles Martel, that is not really interested in attacking the Longobards, and he does not. In fact, the Longobards were his allies. He had also made them come into southern Gaul to deal with the Saracen invasions. In fact, King Liutprand marched with the Longobard army into southern France, seemingly not achieving much, because they weren't particularly interested in to help the Franks either. But at least that was a big, international show-off, saying, okay, we're even able to cross the Alps to go in Provence. That might have been also one of the Longobard objectives in theory, if they had wanted to expand somewhere else, but probably, in my opinion, not so much in terms of practicability at that point. We will maybe talk about this another time, what the options were, maybe later. Then they called Pippin the Short, at a moment where, Pippin the Short now was kind of in charge, kind of in control of the situation. He also becomes legitimately king of the Franks, thanks to the Papal approval, in 753 or 54, I don't remember. The last Merovingian is deposed, and Pippin the Short intervenes, actually because now the Longobards are really putting lots of pressure on the Papal territories, and the Franks already at this point kind of smells the opportunity of making this great Mediterranean leap forward, say. That had been kind of their major strategical ambition since the 6th century, but that now, for generations, nobody had really taken into considerations anymore, because we have seen how the same Merovingian power had crumbled. That broader, far-range, kind of regional, but not continental scale ambitions had been kind of out of reach. So also in here, when Pippin is called by the Pope, also the relations with the Longobards were kind of moderate. They were Franks and Longobards at this time were formally allies on a kind of a diplomatic seat, if we want, anachronistically speaking. But they, or maybe not so anachronistically, telling the truth, but they equally intervene, because at that point the Pope is really attacked militarily by the Longobards. The Franks had already come across it as the protectors of the papacy. So there was a situation in which even the Longobards, I can't say they didn't play it cleverly, but at that point they didn't have also many other options. So they probably thought they could still have a decisive influence on Rome or on the papacy to control it, and to remain and to maintain the status quo fundamentally, and maintaining their power south of the Alps and the Franks north of the Alps. because also the Alps were this major problem that eventually the Franks, thanks to their very developed military and military system, that their logistics and so on are able to overcome. But in fact, those were the Franks, and it was a kind of an amazing feat that could also discourage the same Franks in part to attempt it. Also because up to that point nobody actually knew what the resistance capabilities of the Longobards could really be. I mean, the Longobards at this point kind of also showed fundamentally their weakness in front of the Frankish military force, and this favored also the Franks to kind of push forward this thing, because they realized that they could meet a relatively small resistance, which actually was not so small, especially when it took not much to cross the Alps, but to besiege the main centers of the Po Valley that were kind of the longest Carolingian siege ever was the one of it lasted for 9 months. It was truly exceptional in Western world. I don't know anything like that for centuries in Europe. It was the one of the Longobard capital of Pavia. With Charlemagne, you have a different situation for which, for a certain time after the two expeditions of Pippin the Short into Italy, the Franks consider now the Longobards a sort of client state because they managed to curb it. But there is this moment of kind of reprisal of Longobard autonomistic ambitions, and Charlemagne is called fundamentally into Italy to put to an end to the Longobard power, and so in fact it happens. Also in here, in fact, the first thing that happens is that the popes ask the Franks for some land on their own. That initially is a huge amount of land. Basically, the popes asked for almost all the peninsula for their own power, which is kind of, it immediately tells you what the papal mindset was about at the time, and how determined and perfectly, really clear-minded in their ambitions, in their demands. The popes were what they wanted to achieve, but it's still kind of weird because objectively the popes couldn't control much around, the region of Rome. So also controlling the whole Italy, given that there were the Franks from one side, the Byzantines from another, nobody would have probably let him do it. But that's the card the popes were playing. The idea that they were now a major spiritual authority all over the Christendom, and that could theoretically admonish everyone not to get in their way with the evident threat of becoming an enemy of the church, turning other relative subjects under against their respective kings, etc. And talking about, let's talk now about kind of the Frankish ambitions at this time, because as you have told you now, the Franks had mostly a conservative ambition. I mean, they were expanding, and they were expanding fast, but their major strategical driving factor had been now the relations that existed between the Franks and these populations that surrounded them. There were very pressing and materially evident problems, like the fact of, the Saxons tormenting the Austrasian frontier, the Arabs now launching offensives, so they had to choke the passage on the Pyrenees, creating the Catalonian mark, smashing the Avar Khaganate that now was kind of weak and yet still rich. So and especially curbing the rebellions of all these people, so like the Frisians, and these big chunks of the same empire internally that, albeit under Frankish authority from several years, hadn't been much of a they had revolted fundamentally very very often, and had to be curbed once again. So at this point, the Franks still have a truly continental mindset. I mean, they don't really think about much else. Before the popes called them, they probably have in mind the theory and the possibility of expanding on a broader range, but they lack a reason, they lack a motive. As we were saying before, during the 6th century, the Franks had were in a condition of force. Under Clovis, they had seized enormous territories. They were extremely wealthy. They had this momentum that they wanted to exploit. And after the Ostrogoths are wiped out from Italy, the first thing they do is to launch offenses far deep into the peninsula, where they're halted by the Byzantines, because there is no one defending the peninsula anymore. So theoretically speaking, at that point, the Franks would have kept expanding in the west, trying to participate into the imperial dignity, trying to acquire power, legitimization from the Roman Empire, because this is how the Franks had been grown. The Franks had been grown literally as Roman federati. They knew Rome, they knew how it worked, the imperial system, they knew how they could get legitimized, and they especially had this great ambition, for which they legitimated on the force of their own military accomplishments, their own dominion over the lands that at that point the divinity had given to them. This is a very important and overlooked chapter. I don't know any particular. I would like to read more about this. It's the fact that the Franks at this time, they convert with Clovis directly from paganism to Catholicism. Another very clever move that Clovis chose, differently from almost all the other Germans that instead passed through the Arian heresy, and creating problems also for the local governability in the lands of the former of the former Western Roman Empire. But they still are very much imbued with this pagan mindset. I mean, legitimately, a Frank of the 6th century might have called himself a Catholic, like it was the real definition at the time. Just remember that Catholic doesn't mean like the Catholic Church today. It means at the time in the 6th century, it means Catholic. It was the Orthodox Church proper, because it was the Catholic means universal, from katalon in Greek, and that was the term was defined. The distinction between Catholic and Orthodox is not even so linguistically proper in itself. But what is interesting here is that the Franks, in their pagan mindset, they, however, still shared the concept of imperial authority into their in general. The same one of the Roman Empire. The same Roman Empire had just recently come out of pagan mindset. The 6th century is the same century in which Justinian closes the philosophy school in Athens, starts persecuting more harshly other cults, etc., that were not Christian. So you have to imagine this world that was objectively not much different from the one of 2 centuries afterwards, where paganism and Christianity were still fundamentally not hand in hand, because it sounds too bad, but there was still a very strong hybrid nature of this. And the Franks probably believed, from their imperial perspective, that the right of arms, this was the typical Indo-Aryan belief of every people that had created, incidentally, even the same Roman Empire, that the imperium was in fact a divine gift of the military deity, of the great deity of the sky, that sanctioned who had to fight and who what to rule and who had not. The real belief of peoples like the Franks, the Germans in general, whoever won was legitimated in his rule by the divinity. So it wasn't that difficult to actually overlap the great deity of the sky of the pagan past with the one of the Christian world, because fundamentally, even if you look at the Apollinian ideals, etc., of the late empire, the Hellenism, that was the same thing fundamentally. We know that for centuries the Christian populations of Europe did things like, after having gone out of the church, kind of kneeling in front of the sun because they still thought that was God. I mean, that was the reality of the allegedly Christian world in the Middle Ages. We know this. They were fully Christian, sure, in if they accepted certain beliefs, but for especially from a world that came straight from a polytheistic point of view, it was not at all difficult to combine the various beliefs. So that survived even up to the last century, I believe, into Europe, like as it's widely known. The obviously mediated, always filtered and so on, but still knowing that the tradition, the rite is still something detached from faith. I even made a video on it in whatever. But what I'm pointing out now is that the Franks had felt, in virtue of their own imperial grandeur, legitimized by God to have this imperium. Fundamentally, they didn't even wanted the title of imperator because they thought that, first of all, that was in Latin. And of course, they began to write in Latin once they settled down in Gaul, etc. But it's really the concept of imperium proper that gave the validity to the imperial title in itself. Because the imperial title, it's not like 19th century empires that are fundamentally administrative entities, if you want, still already. But the empire is really also giving the coercive means of the time a sort of a much deeper and even multidimensional, almost metaphysical, in fact, idea. And even that's why before I was talking about the Byzantine legalistic perspective, the Byzantines said, okay, yeah, we are in bed. They basically never gave up that perspective as well, because they said that, of course, God, the empire had been entrusted to the Romans by God, and so on, etc. But there was also the most evident realization that, especially from a pagan perspective, was extremely eloquent, that the Roman Empire had contracted. So de facto, the imperium, meant as a power exercised on a certain people mostly, than actually on a territory, was eventually not there, and that the Franks now had taken them, especially in the West. So how to explain this? So the Franks had maintained this imperial ambition of saying, okay, we will take one day the whole West as for ourselves. This is not really expressed by any source that I know before Carolingian times, at least. But even in Carolingian times, this was not fully developed as an ideology in the sources and so on. It's something that starts happening mostly from Ottonian times. There is all a progressivity. But it's the same. At that point, it's not just about the former geographical borders of the empire. It's about the sheer concept of power that legitimates the rule of conquerors over the vanquished peoples and lands. That now actually has this less brutal character given by Christianization, for which it's not really just conquering the vanquished. It's about also defending the Christian people and the subject. So here, naturally, there is a relatively hypocritical idea, but nevertheless it makes you understand what were the driving reasons for creating an empire, and also the legitimization elements that could be called to be used. Excuse me, I drink a little once again. Here we go. I finished my my water ration, I would say. This is all for saying that the Franks had never forgotten the idea that they could extend their power at the Mediterranean, in the Mediterranean. This is something that the empire would not essentially give up till the very end, but in this central centuries of the Middle Ages, because they understood that the Mediterranean was the true, also for evident economical, infrastructural reasons, the true center of power for any Western power that wanted to emerge. All the Holy Roman Emperors fundamentally tried to subdue the Italian peninsula because that's the place where they wanted to rule from, and to eventually, not just from a symbolical point of view, because Rome was there, the Papacy was there, that was an easy way of controlling the situation, but for the sheer wealth and resources and accessibility to the former lands of the empire. The idea of taking Constantinople was definitely also one defining motive of the let's say one of the definitions, one of the motivations of the Germanic emperors for centuries. No, the idea we reconquer Constantinople, so we reunite East and West, and there are dynasties we actually came close to do such a thing. Also, the imperial marriages were always kind of requested. There was this attempt of legitimizing, also dynastically, in fact, the imperial authority, and this could come only from a direct intervention into Mediterranean that now was possible for the Franks. I mean, in the 6th century hadn't been possible because probably the Byzantines would have halted the Franks on the Alps, at least. The problem now is that, even afterwards, had been that the Byzantines, perhaps exactly for these reasons, had allowed the Longobards to settle into Italy. This is a controversial hypothesis because we don't have any direct evidence of this, but it's highly likely that actually the so-called Longobard invasion of Italy was in fact driven by the Byzantines, who didn't attempt, in fact, mysteriously any response initially. They kind of had been allied with the Longobards at to that point, and more in general were definitely informed of such movements given their international involvement and so on. And also the Longobards also were would have risked by invading an imperial land without permission, but of course they could have done, they probably did it in fact, because it was probably both things at the same time, but they had entered there for this. So what had created what was with the Longobard invasion, basically at least in Italy, the old situation had been reinstated. So before there had been the Ostrogoths, now the Longobards kick in. So once again, the Franks are basically cut off from the Mediterranean, at least from the Italian through the Italian channel, and there are still the Byzantines from the other side. So at this point, also the plague, the general contraction of Europe, etc., during the 6th century as a system, bring the Merovingians to shrink, to collapse, even to start fighting on each other. So for a couple of centuries, that Mediterranean perspective had vanished. Now it represents itself. As we were saying before, the Franks weren't really interested in doing it so quickly. It was something dangerous. It was something that mostly was upsetting the local aristocracy, because we have said that the Carolingians were tied fundamentally to their vassalic clienteles, who also determined the main political directions. At least nobody was. This is a constant in medieval history. Nobody north of the Alps was much interested, aside from kings and emperors, to launch offensives into the peninsula, the Italian peninsula. Because simply they didn't like it. It was a long journey, it was expensive, it was demanding, it was risky, etc. Naturally, the kings and emperors had, a much wider horizons. It was mostly the local provincial aristocracies that, in fact, wanted just to carve their own power locally without any interference, let's say, of a central authority. And this is a bit the constant of the Holy Roman Empire, etc., in their Rome fast, so this travel towards Rome. But at this time in the Frankish world, there evidently there is the there is still a continuous opposition fundamentally, but at the same time there is also the acknowledgement, at least from the Carolingians, that this option, the papal call, can open several opportunities to the Carolingian power, and to reopen the Mediterranean gate in a certain sense, and to enter into Italy. So now, guess what? This is exactly what happened. The Franks seize Italy. They make it fundamentally their most important foreign province. They control it. The Franks send their very best, the elite of their own aristocracies in there. There's lots of Franks coming from the core of Frankish domains of northeastern France. So the big guys that were sent to France, to Italy, because they were to control this land for real. And Italy actually rebelled at a point in the northeast. It was difficult even to extend. The Carolingians kind of tried to extend their power also to the southern Longobards duchies. They failed because also the terrain is extremely harsh. Plus the Byzantines are active now that the Franks have expanded into the Mediterranean, send aids to the remnants of the Longobard kings, the remnants of the Longobard kingdom, to basically back them against the Franks. So it's a very complicated situation that we also have to explain at one point, but it's the general perspective here that is important. So once again the Franks, and let's say not really once again, but finally the Franks manage to extend their power on Italy, and to therefore reassert, even given the immense continental power that they have, their power, their authority on this wide areas of the West. Fundamentally, you can say that more or less that the Franks compensated the absence of the Iberian Peninsula by expanding more, say, eastwards with Germany, with areas of Central Europe that the Romans had not fully controlled. So it's a really big thing that, as we have said before, had its own limits, had its own structural weakness, and in fact it kind of melted away, but the empire didn't melt away. So sort of proof now that the opportunities that could arise from this union, let's say, between the Frankish power and the papal legitimization was definitely favorable, profitable for all involved, at least up to a certain point, that could be regulated, in fact, with these various political and military directions that could take now a direction, one objective, now one another, and were fundamentally dictated on the contingencies. We have seen that the popes kept looking at the Byzantines more or less favorably, given their geographical location. Even for aid against the Franks at some point, there was a continuous play in the sense that also triggered a lot of the development of political theories to justify, fundamentally to legitimize the local government, fundamentally. Legitimate, not legitimize. Yeah. Okay. Well, whatever. It's a slight difference. So, in this perspective, this was achieved also because the Roman Empire had shrank. This is all the more evident. I mean, in the Western Mediterranean, the Roman Empire at this point doesn't. The Byzantines do not have this. Are not in control of the situation. Then they are coping with the Islamic invasions. They're constantly under pressure, also from the Balkanic direction. There is a broader goal to fundamentally that is defensive rather than expansive at this point. Although by the same 9th century, in part, the Byzantines kept re-expanding, recovering strength. Also in the following centuries, they are able to recover the control of certain areas of southern Italy from the Saracens and so on, but they're never able to represent this major impediment to in the north of the peninsula for the Germans to expand to enter the Mediterranean in the first place. And Italy becomes a battleground. This is the real point. It's a very difficult battleground. It's very intermittent, but fundamentally it gets also very dynamic, because the same peninsula within itself is getting quite dynamic. It takes time. The second invasions hit hard Italy as well, just as France and Germany. So there is this initial contraction. There is also a Carolingian kingdom, fundamentally, that remains standing theoretically. It also deals with this invasions, that copes, that maintains this kind of the successor, the same Longobard state. In fact, it maintained its own original name. But the important picture here is that the Franks basically, by the 8th century, occupy this gap that is left, this vacuum that is left by the shrinking of the Byzantine Empire. So what was not possible in the 6th century, because the Justinian reconquers the whole Mediterranean, therefore poses itself in a strong position, let's say, to claim back these territories. In the 8th, there is no one to oppose, in fact, the Frankish advance. And you see it also from the 6th century perspective. I mean, what sense would have made to attack at that point the Byzantines into Italy? In a moment in which the main thing now was to give a form, to give a shape to the newly conquered Frankish power. And of course, newly created Frankish power, of course, the Franks had this momentum that they also wanted to exploit. They probably perceived as, you should press hard on the enemy once you see that it wavers, that it's weak. But at the same time, we know that, at least for how things went historically speaking, at a broader and environmental level, the Merovingians would have probably not managed to control much of Italy at that point. Even if the Longobards had not arrived, and if the Byzantines had remained there, it would have been relatively difficult to tie Italy at that time to the Merovingian power that was, by the way, disgregating and weakening in the following generations. But it would have been interesting, because it might have put a more direct continuity between the ancient imperialistic ambitions of the Franks, meant really in the Roman, really by Roman inspiration, speaking by Roman inspiration, and the creation eventually of a Mediterranean the revival of a Western empire that at that point we don't really know whether it would have existed or not, because what we will see now is also how likely was it, even for the 8th century, of this revival of the Western empire to happen. This is not an easy question to answer, because you can say that broadly speaking the Franks had this theoretical need to expand, and actually Italy might have fallen easily, or relatively easily, into their way, but there were, even at an international level, no real reasons for invading Italy at that point. Not on putting pressure on the Longobards more than much, especially by that 8th century. If you look at it from the Longobards' perspective, or maybe just in a broader perspective, you realize that the Longobards and the Franks passed from being good allies at that point in history, to enemies, and for the Longobards to be conquered by the Franks in a few decades. And that's that was kind of dramatic. You realize that here the popes forced the hand, creating something that otherwise might have not happened. Because nobody says that the Franks might have not one day invaded Longobard Italy, but we don't know. We don't really know. and one factor that actually brought not just to the conquest of the Longobard kingdom, but to the creation of the Carolingian Empire in the first place, it was really determining, was the where the dynastic dynamics were happening within the same Frankish world, because individuals like the major Frankish leaders, even Charlemagne himself, eventually Louis the Pious, etc., is that these great kings had the luck of remaining fundamentally the only surviving male sons of their father. This is particularly important because, as we've seen many times, the Franks splitted the paternal inheritance always among their male sons in equal measure. So this had created enormous succession problems because of the most evident fact that at every generation these lands were split into some part. And at the end of their days, the Carolingians tried to do it, maintaining one big chunk intact and kind of giving it to the lesser brothers smaller parts. This is what happened also with the many illegitimate sons. For instance, Charles the Bald was created a certain territory that eventually would evolve in part to the kingdom of Arles in the centuries, just for himself, because he was kind of a illegitimate son and was a minor figure. But it basically they couldn't make it. It was this cultural limit of the Franks that couldn't get past this procedure, this tradition, and without creating civil strife fundamentally, which happened anyway because now the empire got split and everybody was at war against each other, given it was at the head of a single power on its own. So the main problem was getting rid of this internal competition. It was very difficult to achieve because, in fact, you can imagine how difficult was it to rule actually one great chunk of empire like the Carolingian one, but even and especially when there was someone in the middle who was actively fighting against you. And that was naturally also felt legitimated by dynastic prerogatives and actual rights, and being an internal and very well-rooted ruler that naturally had his own clienteles and so on. So this is the case of Charlemagne. If his brother Carloman had not died and had not gone on his resistance against them, even the conditions for a Longobard invasion would have been terribly difficult, because actually they would have not happened. The same Charlemagne actually married the daughter of the Longobard king Desiderius to find an ally in the Longobards against his brother into Francia. So just for saying that, at this point, just imagine if Charlemagne had died, or someone else had risen at that point against. History might have gone radically different. Just to this add, in fact, the papacy, the new pope had been elected from the Philo-Longobard faction. Also in here, just couple these two eventualities that were quite likely, and you would have not had a Carolingian Empire. You would have had something different. Nobody is denying, in fact, the possibility that this would have happened, but it would have not happened in the way we know it, in the time we know it, and with the consequence we know it. So really, history might have been radically different. From the Longobard point of view, also you have to consider what the situation was. Now, the Franks were enormous in terms of actual power. They had these enormous lands, enormous empires stretching all over continental Europe, and in comparison, the Longobard kingdom was a small thing. It was large enough, like the Papal Valley and Tuscany altogether were just like one of the parts of chunks of empire that the Carolingian domination was made up by. They had some advantages, definitely. They were expanding, so they were actually enlarging their own power in turn. Seizing the whole peninsula was at that time feasible, as we've seen. Ravenna fell. The Longobards were sweeping now through central Italy and solidly reconnecting the southern duchies to the crown of Pavia. Rome was wavering in this sense, more politically than militarily at this point. And it was fundamentally the last true Byzantine not really Byzantine, but the last bulwark of resistance against the Longobards into Italy, because after that, there were a bunch of other, centers in southern Italy that were fundamentally still Byzantine hands, but as we've seen also in here, actually the grip of Constantinople was very weak. It was mostly the local communities that didn't want to be invaded and asked Constantinople for help, but they were also kind of minimally important in the whole, balance, let's say, of forces of the empire. So they couldn't expect they didn't have this enormous political influence. Fundamentally, the most important centers had been Ravenna. That was really not a power not an excessive power. It was fundamentally a solid center. It also was taken seemingly not by military action, but simply because it collapsed internally. So this also reveals to you what the Byzantine influence really was locally. And Rome, that was a thing on its own. So the rest were just certain coastal centers that the Longobards, once Rome had been wiped out, could have been seized on their own. From their side, now the Longobards were mostly pushing through this Umbrian corridor that brought to Rome, and in order to open the ways through the Apennines to besiege Rome more effectively. From Ravenna, interestingly enough, the Longobard king Aistulf, we have seen it, actually shifted during the war against Rome his residence to Ravenna to control better. And these were kind of also wealthy lands, so where they could draw men, resource, and material, which is also witnessed by his laws on recruitment that for the first time engage the juridically non-Longobards into the army, which meant really not those who were in the kingdom were not Longobards, because at that time, fundamentally from a juridical point of view, every single subject of the kingdom had become Longobard. There were a few Romans, and naturally could be people who also came from abroad, in fact from these Byzantine areas of Italy, but the myth that there were Romans still subjugated to the Longobards, they were traded, the sources do not speak of it, simply because there weren't, because everybody had transformed at that point into a Longobard. In Ravenna, there were these new kind of Roman subjects that had remained Roman because they had always dwelled now Ravenna had always remained Byzantine. So local society was structured into, I would say not a Roman fashion, because it's Italic Byzantine fashion that was different in terms of distribution of resources, general administration, economical activities from Longobard Italy, although they were kind of assimilating each other over time. So next step would have been really to control Rome at this point, and to give this finally to the kingdom this fully unitary organization. We have seen many times on the videos on Longobard history how the Longobard kingdom was much more functional than is often credited. This idea that it was split by duchies that were creating only chaos and anarchy is completely false. People are confusing the 10 years that followed, between 574 784, that were the only time of real kind of anarchy, because there was no king. And ever since the Longobard monarchy was created at the end of in 584, nobody actually even said anything. I mean, institutionally speaking, there was this immediate, recognition, even from the southern duchies, that there was a king. There were all Longobards, and now, there were some Longobards that sided with the Byzantines, but those were wiped out quite quickly since the beginning. And even though, the main center was definitely Lombardy, the Po Valley, and Tuscany, the Longobard kingdom still stretched, far and wide when it wanted. Northeastern Italy was definitely politically and strategically coalesced with kingdom. There was no, there were internal strifes sometimes for who was to be elected king, but not the kingdom was never put into discussion. The southern duchies were subdued continuously, not continuously, but every once in a while they kind of rebelled, because they instead that appointing the local Gastald sent by there was this official sent by the capital of Pavia in the north. They elected a local aristocrat, so simply, the royal army moved from the north. It literally marched simply on these duchies. There was no even actually a real war as we imagine it. So now, however, having seized Ravenna, this passage between northern and central Italy and southern Italy could be fluidified. Actually, the most reluctant duchy in Italy was the one of Spoleto, that resisted. It was in central Italy, framed into the Apennines. It's also difficult to reach, but it wasn't a power that wasn't a detrimental power to the unity of the kingdom. Was kind of there. That often sided with the exarchate of Ravenna, even with the papacy sometimes. But it was simply subdued several times. And also in there, what's the problem that it posed to the unity of the kingdom? Is there that Pavia was ever sacked by a Spoletan army? It could never happen. They didn't have the power to do anything like that. So, however, now the perspective of organizing the whole peninsula under a kind of a contiguous rule that had been prevented from the Byzantine corridor that had existed, in fact, through to Ravenna and Rome, through this Umbrian channel, was there. And it could have been very easily accomplished. As a matter of fact, after the fall of the Exarchate, also this kind of this channel had been fundamentally seized. Now the problem was just to take Rome. What were the Longobards thinking about the Franks? Well, really not much. They were naturally content to be allies with them. There were these two major entities in Europe that had their own, they had their coexistence now in the last century. There had been no problems of sort, and no hostility. They were formally allies. The Longobard kings went to the Frankish court, sometimes even as young as the princes, to be even kind of adopted by the Frankish king, ideally, politically. So they intermarried. So there was this reciprocal respect. Also, the Franks weren't people who respected much, others. They considered just the Longobards their peers. The rest of the Germanic populations were like like the Saxons, or the other entities that dwelled around them. They just saw them as their either their enemies, but as a kind of a rabble. Like, even think about the Saxons were considered pagans and uncivilized already by the Franks. So it's not the Frankish standards were pretty high. So the Longobards instead presented this solidly administered kingdom that had maintained a strictly Germanic character in its institutions, and they had never done anything wrong fundamentally. Even politically speaking, the Franks were kind of sneaky with the Longobards, because they fundamentally betrayed them several, at least a couple of times. Even Charlemagne, when he had to invade Italy, repudiated the Longobard princess. At that time, in Germanic law internationally, was something like, how do you repudiate her? Just because he had to invade Italy now, because the Pope had called him. So the Franks had learned how to play dirty since an early age, really taking literally everything they could as individual dynasts to aggrandize themselves, to strengthen their authority, to legitimize their power. This had started, in fact, betraying the same Germanic freeman's model since the beginning. Like Clovis surpassed completely the tribal perspective, becoming, in fact, a Romano-Germanic ruler, allied with the local church, with the local aristocracies, and wiping out the rest of the Frankish nobility with assassinating them fundamentally, because that's how it happened. The Longobards had created this kingdom in Italy that also was one of the few examples of a functionally elective monarchy out there. The Longobards elected actually pretty good kings all the time. They were effective rulers. They legislated. They didn't have any competitor. This is what saved, kind of paradoxically, what had saved Italy, because even in the misfortune, because the senatorial estates in Italy had been wiped out during the Gothic War, like because of the devastations and so on. So differently from Gaul in Spain, where the local senatorial aristocracies, Romanized aristocracies, had eventually remained, and the Goths and the Franks had not managed to wipe them out, but they were necessarily brought to cooperate with them, sensibly weakening their power. When the Longobards arrived in Italy, they didn't find any aristocracy that was fundamentally contrasting them, because guess what? They had been all wiped out. So this incredibly favored, first, the process of assimilation of the Germanic element into the Romanic population, that now looked upon way more favorably the Germanic freeman model proposed by Longobards than the colonist, the colonial one brought by the senatorial elites that just wanted to use the rural populations for working in their property. And secondly, the Longobards didn't have any internal opposition in terms of aristocracies, unlike the Franks, because the only, first of all, the Longobard aristocracies were much poorer than Frankish ones. The Frankish ones had developed this uncontrolled privatization during the centuries, during the crisis of Merovingian authority, and had developed their prerogatives on their own as private aristocrats and so on, through the estates that we have seen as well. The Longobards didn't have anything like that. The most influential aristocracies were the ones that dwelled into the cities and that were engaged into this kind of civil administration of the kingdom that, if anything, created competition within the same administrative structures for rising to the top, and therefore having a better role in strengthening the administration, justice, and so on. The Longobard king himself was not extremely powerful in terms of private assets. It was simply it had its own resources that definitely allowed him also to move an army, to have, but it was not as rich as even some parts of the Frankish nobility. So this system kind of worked more or less, civically speaking. Perhaps towards the very end there were now agitations, because with the economical revival it was more difficult to control all this the rise of the cities, of trade and commerce and so on, to discipline it fundamentally. But it definitely had its own balance that wasn't fundamentally altered until the Frankish invasion, that also drastically reorganized the Italic society on models that were more similar, in fact, to the Frankish one, with the vassalic clienteles that now impoverished drastically the local freemen that were extremely wealthy per capita in Italy. They were actually the wealthiest in the world at that time, and that in fact never conferred to Italy this kind of hybrid nature that it maintained also throughout the rest of medieval history, where you have a feudal class, but that is always paired with a urban elite that sometimes are the same people, but that definitely operate in very different environments compared to the north of north of the Alps, where already urbanization was much less developed, was much less political, much less juridical practice, literacy, etc. And so this kingdom was also, that's the reason why the Carolingians were extremely careful about how they handled Italy, because they knew that it was a precious place to administrate, and even if they went with kind of iron fist in there, they also had to invent kind of clever ways to control it, because it wasn't easy. Also, given these external actors that we have seen. So, what if the Longobards had not been crushed by the Franks at that point? The frontiers, the Longobards couldn't really halt the the frontiers of the Alps was relatively penetrable, as it was proved also in the war against the Franks. But at that point, it was mostly a matter of internal defense that could cope with, that could man the infrastructures that were built at Alpine foothills to at the opening of the Alpine valleys to stem the Frankish advance. The Franks had a better army, and this is the truth. And this is the point. The Franks were the only ones who were developing that professional army that we have seen. In Europe, it was unknown. So the Longobards actually moved substantial resources, and they had other to spend when they were, even when they were crushed by the Franks. So they had this, actually probably a greater wealth than is often considered, but they couldn't withstand this military machine. Also, back in the 6th century, you can argue that the Franks were already kind of more developed. They had a better military organization than the Longobards. So the Longobards had basically adverted the Frankish Byzantine power by assaulting, by enclosing themselves into these cities, and they let the epidemics to kill their enemies that in fact also lacked organization between the Franks and the Byzantines, lacked coordination between the Franks and Byzantines, and were eventually to abandon the Po Valley, from which eventually the Longobards led this counterattack, especially on Byzantine Italy, and got the upper hand eventually. And at this time, were managing to wipe out the Byzantines from the rest of the peninsula. So what happened now is that there were many options. Naturally, if Rome had been taken, this would have been an immense goal from the Longobards. We should definitely think that the papacy would have not stood there, in the sense that probably there would have been some exiles, including other supporters of the pro-Frankish faction, that might have asked them to intervene against the Longobards. So it's not really said that the conquest of Rome would have brought to, now they had the papacy and everything's fine. That's why I stress the importance of other events that were happening within the Frankish world, chiefly the chance of these kings to intervene without the internal interference of other brothers or hostile aristocracy. But at that point, it's possible that the Longobards would have oriented their action chiefly. I don't really know. I think they would have expanded chiefly towards the northeast. They would have tried to frame better the northeastern duchies into the wall system, and they would have tried to counter the Byzantines in the Dalmatian coast, because that's what that's where most of the trade passed from, especially from now Venice was developing. Also, Comacchio was an important center. These were all areas of Byzantine Italy that the Longobards at this time also had not fully recovered. Probably taking those lagoons would have been fairly easy. It was very difficult for the Franks. For instance, the Franks didn't achieve it. Even the son of Charlemagne, Pippin of Italy, king of Italy, died of malaria, and the warfare was happening there in the lagoons against this Byzantine or Byzantine-backed entity in there, in the Venezia, as it was called, from the ancient Roman region, the province. Sorry, and that would have been, in my opinion, the main route of expansion, because it equated to control the traffics with the east through the Adriatic Sea. It would have secured fundamentally also the unity of the Po Valley in itself. What if at that point? Well, it's also kind of difficult to tell, because Sicily was still Byzantine at this point, and it was going to be progressively conquered by the Arabs from the beginning of the 9th century. So given in these few decades afterwards, probably the Longobards, if they had been clever, they might have intervened into Sicily in some way and held it, and trying to consolidate southern Italy, wiping away the last Byzantine outposts. But it's difficult. Whether, I don't know, it's really just an hypothesis. I doubt personally that they would have managed to invade Provence, that is southeastern France, because why bothering with that? That was Frankish territory first, so they would have angered the Franks. Secondly, yeah, okay, it was it was full of cities and rich. The Rhone Valley was definitely profitable. It had ancient ties with Italy since the Roman times, but at the same time, that was an area of frontier where there were the Saracens were on one side, the Franks were in the north. Why inserting them in the clash? Let just kill each other on their own. Possibly the Longobards would have reinforced the Alpine passes, that's for sure. It's difficult to tell what kind of evolution the kingdom would have had from a political and institutional point of view, because it wasn't that easy at that point to control all this land anymore. Part of the efficiency of the kingdom had derived exactly from the relative compactness of the Po Valley and Tuscany, as lands that were, the Po Valley was the core as Lombardy of the Longobard rule, and Tuscany was seized fundamentally without without particular promise. It was directly ruled by the kings of Pavia. The other duchies might have caused some turmoil once this big system had consolidated, if they had acted all together. But at the same time, why? After all, it was better to consolidate the whole system and to strengthen definitely the prerogatives that would have stemmed from the control of the papacy at that point. And that's probably what also the Longobards would have needed, in my opinion, to transform into a maritime power as well, because they had actually the potential. We know the Longobards, this is also an overlooked chapter. We said that they were mostly a terrestrial power, but they also had their naval operations. They even sent to the Bulgar Khan some ship builders into the Balkans from Italy. So they also manned some ships. They did carry out some operation against Sardinia. They seized Corsica as well. So there were several options that were perhaps mainly conservative. I mean, there is this other option of actually not taking much action against any foreign enemy and just reinforcing the kingdom into this general weakness of the whole system. Always given that the Franks probably would have remained the main military threat if they had ever decided to enter into the peninsula. But without the tensions with the papacy, objectively there were no valid reasons for it. I mean, apparently. And there is also to consider that the Longobards had, however, interests into the northeast of their domains. They had always kind of exercised a control on the Bavars in southern Germany. I think their main aim was to drive them away from the Franks, because I don't think they had any particular need to to expand towards the north. I mean, yes, of course, they had conquered to the Bavars certain lands that actually are from the Danubian side of the watershed, the Alpine watershed, not just from the Po Valley one, the Po one. But at the same time, you know, that they were kind of two distant areas. I also doubt the Longobards would have had the means to directly intervene against the Avars. The Longobards at this point didn't have perhaps the military capabilities, even logistically speaking, to, you know, to wipe them out so directly and effectively like the Carolingians did. And after all, they could be an ally, because in fact, if the Franks had wanted to expand into along the Danubian area, they would have kind of encircled, in fact, the Longobard kingdom, as it happened, by the way, before the Carolingian conquest of Italy, because the Charlemagne has also secured its control over Bavaria for kind of encircling. Yeah, so yeah, mostly a conservative and mostly, however, maritime-oriented interest, because that's where also for defending from the Byzantines, from the Saracen Papacy, that would have been kind of obvious to do, in my opinion. So yeah, this were, in my opinion, the Longobard options, but you know, things change very quickly. It's difficult to tell even what can or cannot be achieved. So going back instead to the papacy, we already talked about this Romano-Italic social-cultural identity that somehow was alive into Byzantine Italy, that now was revolving chiefly around the papacy, around Rome as the main center of power that was different from the Longobard one. And so this area was tendentially less ambitious from a territorial point of view, because it didn't have a true territorial consistency. We saw how the papacy actually asked the Franks to take control over the whole peninsula, but they didn't have the means effectively to achieve it. And they were generally, I mean, the support that came to Rome from these entities, some of which were partly also Longobard, like the Duchy of Spoleto, especially during when the Franks were now about to attack and the situation was desperate, were to entrust themselves to the Pope as a political entity. This is kind of meaningful, because it tells you how it also how this entity was actually weak. So that relatively to that thing about the threat that this terrible duchies in the Longobard kingdom could pose to the crown, well, that's what the kind of, you know, they couldn't even withstand Rome. In a certain sense, or at least they entrusted themselves to it rather than with the Franks, because that's what they feared. Now, they were clever on their own. When the Franks were about to invade the kingdom, everybody knew it. Even from the north, were kind of Longobards fleeing like in France to save themselves, because they knew what would happen. And because the Carolingian conquest was harsh. I mean, it wasn't so harsh like in other lands, like in Saxony, of course, but it still wasn't such a happy thing to live within. So the leading factor, let's say, what I was saying, sorry, is that all these other Romano-Italic entities were now simply trying to save their own space, like they were chiefly cities or entities revolving around chiefly the coastal areas we said it of Byzantine Italy, and now they just wanted to be left on their own. So they were less ambitious than the unifying ambition of Germanic tradition that the Longobards were trying to impose on the peninsula. That would have been probably better, however, as an option, if anything, because it would have given more homogeneity to the government. The Longobards weren't actually such a heavy presence, even in terms of taxes, etc., than the Byzantines had been. So back in the day, in fact, when the Byzantines were still kind of ruling with certain degree of authority on Italy, their tax pressure brought many inhabitants of the same Byzantine lands actually to flee into the Longobard ones because they paid less taxes there. And in fact, that's how the Longobard kingdom had developed in general. They hadn't been so. They definitely lost this initial chance to work as one to wipe out the Byzantines immediately from the peninsula, because at that time there was no mobile Byzantine army into the peninsula. In 568, they might have, if they had been a united people instead of fragmented, yes, at that time, into several clans, they might have literally swept out the Byzantines. But even the fact that, although having the upper hand, it took like 150 years before now finally seizing all the Byzantines' lands, etc., reveals you that the Longobard kingdom was also not excessively warlike. It wasn't. It was more. It had a kind of light form of government, albeit effective. A light, albeit effective form of government that kind of worked and presented genuinely a positive model for the development of those areas. Perhaps too much, because now also, it would have been better, perhaps, for at least from a strictly royal Longobard perspective, in a Longobard perspective at once, considering the eventual Carolingian conquest, to have had a more structured, a more elitary, more aristocratic character as a kingdom, like the Frankish one really was. But also the Romano-Germanic traditions that the Longobards had managed to develop in Italy, in terms of administration, of justice, legislations, were actually pretty good, pretty solid. It was an order, it was a general peacefulness, and things started to go wrong now just with when the Carolingians knocked at the door and proved by entering without, with force, that Italy could be easily conquered, could be easily invaded, at least maybe not so easily maintained, but definitely easily invaded. So at that point, that's also what probably broke some resistance within the Frankish aristocracy and made the Carolingians take this very big step of, okay, let's do it, let's conquer this whole kingdom, let's become these new defenders of the papacy, let's reaffirm our imperialistic ambition. And that's how the Carolingian Empire was born. That's why this triangle, Franks, Longobards, papacy, is so crucial for medieval history, because this is really a crossroad where everything could have taken literally another path. I'm saying this because the history is told very often just only from the Frankish perspective. Oh yes, the Franks were just another of these weird powers that exist in the Middle Ages. They expanded, they conquered, and that's all what they wanted. Yeah, no, there were all these big problems, actually, these great directions, this great also conservatism that definitely existed. I mean, on all the great moments of an expansion, there is always someone who says, look, but are we going to do a good thing? Because most of Frankish aristocrats were not actually very interested into Italy at all, just wanted to dwell on their own where they were, and that's kind of a constant in many times in history. So this was decided at a big level. It was a strictly political decision. I mean, the Franks were not being threatened by the Longobards. They didn't have any other valid reason for invading them than the papal call. So it was answering that call that history was made, and that the Carolingian Empire became what it became, also in relation with the church, etc., and gave birth to the old Roman Empire eventually, and so on. So this is particularly important. It's a crucial watershed in history, and it's definitely tied to these key figures in history, like, in fact, Charles Martel, Pippin the Short, Charlemagne, the various popes that called the Franks into Italy, the same Longobard kings, their Longobard action, their royal action, their relation with Rome, their intervention in internal papal events. The Byzantines in part, but the Byzantines, in fact, this is also the great conclusion you can draw, that the Byzantines now had lost control of the situation. They could intervene in the West, but they didn't have that grip now, and the Franks simply filled that vacuum. That's how it happened, really. There is also another note in this that stems also from a reflection on the Romano-Italic world. That is the political choice also in here of the papacy in stressing, in this sense, the voice of this entity, the ability of projecting itself into a future where the Mediterranean cultural vocation and the ecclesiastical primacy of Rome was reaffirmed, and that was reaffirmed also because definitely of a collapse of the Byzantines in many ways that had happened in previous centuries, at least in those areas. This is particularly important, first because, yeah, you don't have to give for granted what history eventually came to be. At this point, really, it was perceived that there was a lack of authority that had to be filled. The idea of the empire had not disappeared. I can't stress this enough. The idea of the empire was still alive there, and the popes were toying with this because they knew that it could be used for political purpose. And this also astonishing, self autonomization that the Church of Rome made, and on this occasion also by crowning the Frankish king as emperor of the West at that point. But it's not important now, that the idea of the West, if not from a sheer geographical point of view, because it's meaningful that it was an emperor now, that it was a ruler that was not perceived just like a king of the Franks, but it was considered as an overlord that had also duty to protect the papacy and Christianity, therefore, the world Christianity. And that, however, was still conceived in pair with the Emperor of Constantinople. The Emperor of Constantinople was never drawn away from the equation. That's what the popes could also really cleverly play with. That's what we have said before. They could play with these two actors at once, and from their division, from their hostility, benefit. And this is how it happened, because as soon as the Franks invaded Italy, basically the warfare with the Byzantines on a greater or smaller scale fundamentally started immediately, actually, between the two parties. And the same call against the Longobards was meant also in this sense. But in this sense, you can say that the Longobards suffered from the fact of not being of not belonging territorially to the empire. I mean, not even the Franks, of course, did, but if the Longobards had been kind of federati of the empire, they might have acted on behalf of the emperor on the pope. This was probably surged by Heistulf in the moment where the Franks were hitting him hard. It's not that he wanted to betray at all the Longobard traditions, but on a diplomatic seat, he wanted to give the Byzantines, probably asked at least, or scoped the option to give the Byzantines some guarantees for making himself consider, as King of the Lombards, an ally of Constantinople, and acting on behalf of it in Italy, which was kind of a clever move. At that point, the kingdom was in grave danger. The Longobards were still in condition of force into Italy, so now they were kind of making a gift to the Byzantines, saying, okay, yeah, we wiped you out from here, so you're not a threat anymore, but we can still say that we rule in here on your behalf, like it happened with the Ostrogoths back in the day. That would have conferred definitely the Longobards a greater prestige, authority, and legitimization in dealing with the papacy, and also in this sense recovered a sort of authority also towards the Franks, because now the Franks, by invading Italy, were pushing the Longobards also increasingly from the side of the Byzantines. In fact, helped also the son of the last Longobard king to recover the throne and to paying, and this happened in part eventually. Also backing the southern duchies that had survived, etc. So what is striking here, in my opinion, is the revival of the imperial perspective at all levels. I mean, papacy with the Franks, the Byzantines with the Longobards, because they wanted now to determine whose land were these. On the video we made on Heistulf, we explained how now the big problem that posed like that was posed by the two invasions of Pippin the Short of the Longobard kingdom was that now the Frankish king was issuing the Longobards to was ordering the Longobards to give back to Rome not only the territories that had belonged to the Papacy, theoretically, that theoretically were also Byzantine, but even the lands of the Exarchate. Now, the lands of the Exarchate were being traded fundamentally on behalf of the Franks from the Longobards to the Pope. So what it was astonishing in this perspective is that the Franks, and they did this evidently on purpose, and however being aware of what they were doing, they were fundamentally dictating what lands of imperial territory had to be given to, and not even to the empire, back to the empire. So saying, okay, let's give them back to the Byzantines because those are the lands, these lands were theirs. No, they were ordering the Longobards to give back those lands to the popes. So you see here also the perspective of territorial construction of papal states, how it was fundamentally taking shape. And in fact, it's fundamentally from the 8th century that we start talking about a real territorial expansion of the papacy as a sort in the construction of the papal states, because this is also kind of relative to pinpoint, but Rome theoretically was part of the Byzantine Duchy of Rome. It wasn't an ecclesiastical land, simply because in the Byzantine Empire, the bishops had certain local prerogatives in the management and administration, but they absolutely had to obey to the empire, to the emperor. So here was the other way around, and that's also how the Franks were relating themselves towards the papacy because now they were naturally, the popes hadn't called the Franks in Italy for nothing. They also wanted to ensure they wouldn't take the place of the Longobards as a potential threat, and they wanted power on their own to manage. And this was an object of contempt for literally half of a millennium, because up to it, I think it was in 1274 that Rudolf of Augsburg fundamentally entrusted to the papacy the territories of part, at least, of the territories of including Ravenna and those areas of Romagnol areas, to the papacy finally, because this had been the great kind of debate, the main problem. And so this is what we can draw fundamentally as big conclusions of this phenomenon. So and there is another perspective that is often unheard of, that is the one of the Longobard Italic episcopate that also existed as a church on its own. The Longobards, as we were saying, are often depicted like these terrible Aryan monsters, where the Longobards from the mid-7th century basically convert to Catholicism, and by now they were mostly a most Catholic, one of the most Catholic countries in the world. But let's say there had been initially in the first days of the Longobard kingdom this fundamental let's say dialectics, let's say better, without stressing the conflictuality of it, between in fact the Roman episcopate and the one of Italy, because theoretically Italy pertained to Rome, at least great parts of it pertained to the diocese of Rome, and now the Longobards had seized part of these lands. So they were ruling over some clergy that at that point depended from the Pope, ecclesiastically speaking, but de facto was a Longobard subject. So over the centuries, actually, the Longobard conquest, far from being this monstrous catastrophe that is often depicted, actually brought some of the local episcopate of Italy to side with the Longobards, hoping to receive fundamentally a an important legitimization from these rulers that now had come, that were enforced there, etc., and to autonomize themselves from Rome, which punctually happened, because definitely some of the most some most important dioceses of Italy now were under Longobard control. The bishops, the clergy were fundamentally Longobard. There was this general, belonging, sense of belonging, etc. So there was also this perspective of a further political tool that the Longobard kings could use in terms of control of the of progressive absorption of the papal power. That is fundamentally integrating it in their Longobard Italic episcopate. That was already structured in its own. Wasn't nothing particular. It wasn't, as we were saying, a church that posed itself against the system. Now it wasn't perceived at all as a national church like it would happen, I don't know, in the low Middle Ages with certain countries like France, etc. It was normally episcopate, but now definitely tied to the Longobard rule as well. So there were many clergymen in the Longobard kingdom that were not siding with the papacy, definitely, but most of them were siding with Pavia, with the Longobard kings, obviously. Aside from some of them that were also closer to Rome, they had more interests, could hope to benefit from that, of course, as always. But this faithfulness of the Longobard kings to their own church, as a matter of fact, to Catholicism, and the presence of a clergy that supported their action also against the Pope, that this time was not the universal power that would become in after the Gregorian forms, but in spite of his spiritual primacy, was still fundamentally a bishop like all the others in the West, and it was important because it could be played at that time. The papacy was not meant to be also in here what it became eventually. So be mindful of this as well. The major competitors had been the Spanish bishops, the Bishop of Toledo, for instance, were building, in that case, legitimately a kind of a national church that was also inspired to the Constantinopolitan models of universalistic ambitions. Fundamentally, it was a competitor with Rome, and Rome, when Spain was invaded by the Muslims, essentially played this card by wiping out wiping out fundamentally the Visigothic right and imposing the Roman one on them to avoid any further survival of that church that had been a possible competitor. For the rest, and that's also why the hegemony of the Church of Rome started progressively in the West. The Frankish church now was perfectly aligned with Rome, at least in theory, because the Franks were protectors of Rome. The general idea was that, in fact, now also the Anglo-Saxon church was faithful to Rome. The Carolingians were carrying out, even through the Irish missionaries, actually, the evangelization of these other peoples in Central Europe, etc. So on behalf of the Roman Pope. So also this mattered because it stressed the division between East and West, and the measure in which now Rome was directing tendentially in spite of siding politically either with the Western and the Eastern Empire, was however evangelizing Europe on through the Franks, through the Western Empire, leaving the Eastern Empire in this sense kind of doing it on its own and in competition with Rome. So also in this perspective, aside from the Roman swinging between East and West, but fundamentally doing whatever they wanted from Italy because that's where they wanted to build their lordship from, was however stressing the existence of a Western world proper that functioned in this sense with a unique emperor, with a unique church, and that's how it went, in fact, developing in the Middle Ages. And at the end of the day, the Orthodox Church, the remained minority, because eventually the Byzantine Empire crumbled also because of this Western invasion. It's considered 1204 in this sense, but yeah, for saying how history takes different paths, different turns very quickly and very easily, and how you don't have to give for granted those moments in history that nobody actually cares much about, to tell it all on average today, or definitely not as many as they should. So for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you are interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.